Big welcome. Big welcome to you all. This is our first public offering of the year. So Happy New Year, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you for the rest of the year too. It's a lovely way to start our year to have Ian Baker with us. He's, for some of you who've seen Ian Baker or know something about Ian Baker, the following will not be of fantastic interest because you already know about him. But for those of you who don't, first of all, the title of today's talk is Sacred Geography, Exploring the Hidden Lands of the Buddhist Himalayas. And Ian holds an MPhil in anthropology and a PhD in history and was honored by the National Geographical Society as one of the 7 explorers for the millennium for his field research leading to the documentation of the sacred waterfall that Tibetan texts describe as the portal of the innermost realm of Beyul Pemako, the hidden land arrayed like lotuses. He is the author of 7 books on Himalayan Tibetan cultural history, environment, art, and medicine, including The Heart of the World, A Journey to Tibet's Lost Paradise, and Tibetan Yoga Principles and Practice. Now, as a little trailer, now we're on the subject of hidden lands and the innermost secrets of things. Ian will be giving, I think, how many talks is it now? Is it 6 talks or 5 talks, Ian?
For the course in February, it's a series of 4 talks.
It's 4 talks, and it starts on Saturday, the 5th of February. And the title of it is Embodying the Quest for Perfection and Actualizing the Innermost Essence of Buddhism. So these talks will take place on the 5th, and the link you'll find on the Buddhist Society site, on actually this, the thing that advertises the sacred geography. So please do think of joining in and going further and more deeply into the subject. But I don't want to take up any more time. Just to say that when you have a question during the talk, you'll see a little thing at the bottom where you can write a question on the chat line. Do you see the little chat thing at the bottom of your screen? Those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, you just press on that. You can then type a question, and then I'll ask Ian that question at the end, because there may be lots and lots of them. And I don't want to kind of cut anyone out, but sometimes the questions are duplicated and so on. So it does give me a chance to sort of edit them a bit. And we've only got half an hour, so it also gives Ian a chance to expound further on the subject. So with that, I'll say thank you, Ian, so much.
Sure.
Ian at the moment is up in Cawdor Castle. Yep. And he's off to Thailand and then to Bhutan. And in Bhutan, he'll be leading a retreat, and there'll be various other exciting things going on there. So Ian, thank you very, very much for coming again.
Thank you very much, Desmond. And I'll speak to some of the things you brought up in the introduction at the end of the talk, particularly the course on embodying great perfection and the retreat and pilgrimage in Bhutan, which in a certain sense is continuing some of what I'll be talking about tonight in the context of exploring hidden lands of the Buddhist Himalayas. So I will, and I'm, as Desmond kindly introduced, he'll be handling the questions. I'll talk for about an hour. I'm not pressed for time personally, but I will try to keep my talk to about an hour so that we have, for the designated period, at least 30 minutes for questions and answers. And as I said, if it goes over that, that's okay from my side, but I'm not sure if it will be for everybody, at the Buddhist Society who's kindly hosting this talk. So we'll see how that goes. And therefore, I just would give a few. I know it's sort of wonderful to see that over 200 people now who have joined this talk, and I'm sure many of you who are there have perhaps heard me talk about the hidden lands and about my book, The Heart of the World, before. But as you'll probably know, I always try to make it different. I mean, my ongoing research and reflections on the journeys that I've made in the past and the ones that I'm making currently, always bring for me a kind of new perspectives. And also from the questions that I receive from all of you, it's always a way of deepening the journey. It's as Henry David Thoreau said, one always takes any journey twice, once physically in the landscape, and then after that through the contemplative process of remembering the journey, and either writing about it in his case, as well as in mine, but also how the journey deepens through reflection. And I think it's also interesting in that regard to think about this talk happening in the context of what's essentially now at least self-quarantine, because I just was recently reading how the word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantena, when it literally means 40 days, and it referred to a 40-day period in which ships' crews and passengers were kept on board in the port of Venice in the 15th century during the height of the Black Plague, in order to be sure that none of them were going to bring the plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, as it were, into the port. And it was very interesting because in the context of those enforced isolations on board without the boat going anywhere, there was a lot of storytelling. And the storytelling, of course, that would have occurred in such context, being on the boat, marooned, as it were, in a harbor, were stories of hidden lands, hidden islands, and magical places. And I think this is really speaking to the fact that something so deep in the human psyche is about the quest for magical islands of immortality, imaginary mountains, places of passage, places that are thresholds. And if we look at that, and even in the context of the talk now being hosted by the Buddhist Society, we can even think of Prince Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, 2,500 years ago, having spent the majority of his life kind of confined within the palace walls. And of course, for him, it was all about the magic and wonder. Even though he seemed to have everything inside those walls, he got restless. And for him, the great adventure was to heed the call to go beyond the palace walls and to begin the journey that led him to the kind of insights that we now have as the Buddhist tradition, that we here are all connected with in some way or another, in that process of trying to wake up to our actual nature and our experience, and how we take that into the world with us on our journeys and in our interactions with the world. So given the fact that we have limited time, I'm going to share my screen and begin a slideshow, and then we'll come back at the end with the question and answers. But let me just see if this works smoothly. I'm going to, let's see. Can you all see that? I hope you can. Yep. So I'm not, yes, and let me just see. I want to be sure that I'm not talking to the void, because I'm not, this isn't showing, whoops. Anyway, yeah, I'm assuming that everybody can hear me. So we're just going to go ahead with this. So sacred geography, exploring the hidden lands of the Buddhist Himalayas. Once is what we're talking about today. And this is the image that you saw on the promotional material for the talk. And this refers to a series of expeditions that I made into various parts of the Himalayas over more than a 10-year period, beginning in the 1980s and particularly in the 1990s, going deeper into the hidden land of Pemaku. So this is an image which I'll be referring back to later, in the hidden land of Pemaku and Lower Pemaku, in an area that's now in what was historically Tibet, but is now the part of Arunachal Pradesh in India. So this is the book, The Heart of the World, that I think some of you may be familiar with. This is the earlier cover, and The Heart of the World, A Journey to the Last Secret Place. It was just recently republished, and at that occasion, that was just before lockdown began, and I had a talk at the Buddhist Society on that occasion for the launch of the new edition, which you see the cover of on the right, which has color photographs as opposed to the first edition, which only showed black and white. And this is really a chronicle of the journeys that I had made into the Tibetan hidden lands at that time. I always there's one of the epigraphs that I use in the book, which I find is for me really speaks to the issue of what these hidden lands are, is from a book by Simon Schama called Landscape and Memory, in which he writes, "There have always been two kinds of Arcadia, shaggy and smooth, dark and light, a place of bucolic leisure and a place of primitive panic, the idyllic as well as the wild." Now, I find that a very inspiring and appropriate evocation of what hidden lands are, because although they're described on the one hand as being earthly paradises, they're also places that are traditionally held to be extremely difficult to reach, with full of all kinds of arduous encounters and obstacles en route, and often can lead to, as we'll see as we move on, they have both aspects to them present. And this is something I think which is, of course, what we see in our everyday lives. You know, there's to use the Buddhist terms, there's the dukkha, you know, the suffering and the dissatisfaction, but there's also the sukha. There's also the you know, the great pleasure, the bliss and magic of life. And it's about negotiating and, to use it again, the Tibetan Buddhist term, the rochik, you know, the equal taste, the one taste of these sides. That's where we begin to find our way through the hidden land into our true nature, as well as into the very nature of reality itself. So these journeys that I'll be sharing with you today took place mostly in the so-called hidden land of Pemaka, which lies at the very southeast of Tibet, where the great bend of the Tsangpo River creates this hairpin bend, as you see it here. And this is a mountain, a sacred mountain called Abu Lashu, that's held to be the seat of the protector deity of Pemaka. So I'll speak about that more as we move forward. And again, these were journeys that were not just about wild landscapes of the Himalayas, but also a deep inner journey and meetings with great and remarkable teachers throughout the Himalayan world, such as the Lama that we see here in the enlightened cave of Yeshit Sogyal in Terdrum in Tibet. I also I think it's very important to point out that you know, we're not just talking about a phenomena that's unique to the Himalayas or Bhutan. And in terms of my own sort of personal story, my whole enchantment with numinous landscapes, if we can call it that, began most specifically during the time that I lived in Norway with my mother and stepfather and sister when we moved there when I was 13. And I was caught, my imagination was inspired by these extraordinary mountains in Norway, this one being Statind up near the Arctic Circle in northern Norway, an extraordinary peak that I had, you know, the good fortune to climb with my two brothers and my stepfather a number of years ago. But it's this idea of how nature and the mind and the process of either climbing or circumambulating, various ways in which we interact with landscape, which brings about a transformation of our experience. This was my teacher, Chatrul Sengidorji Rinpoche, who I was fortunate to practice, to visit, to go up to Yomo, hidden land in central Nepal. I went up for many summers where I stayed in intensive retreat in various caves that he sent me to. And for those of you who are familiar with the Heart of the World, it kind of narrates my experiences and tutelage and guidance into the whole hidden land phenomena by Chatrul Rinpoche, as you saw there. And these were, of course, hidden lands that are described as lying throughout the Himalayan ranges, not just Nepal and not just Tibet, but along the borderlands, everywhere from kind of Kashmir to through Nepal, northern India, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and into what's now Arunachal Pradesh in northeastern India. So here we're looking at the Himalayan range from the north, from Tibet, and on the other side of that would be, in this case, Nepal. So I made many journeys after learning first about the phenomena of hidden lands from my teachers, and Chatra Rinpoche in particular. I should mention at this point that it was not only Chatra Rinpoche's personal experience with hidden lands that inspired me, but his recounting of the experiences of one of his great teachers was the female treasure revealer, Sarah Kondro, who in 1917 had actually had visions to open a hidden land at the eastern end of the Kunlun mountain range in this case of at Amimachen in northeastern Tibet, in the Golok region of Tibet. And she, following the visions that she received of Dakinis, sought to open a portal into a hidden land and to reveal hidden treasures. So this was one of the first stories that I'd heard of the hidden lands phenomena, which excited my imagination. But then I also heard about Troshik Lingpa. So Troshik Lingpa was the father of Chatra Rinpoche's wife, Sangyum, his consort Kamala, whose father had been a great treasure revealer and who made a journey in 1962 to try to open a hidden land in Sikkim, which had been written about in Tibetan texts. And an extraordinary book written by a friend of mine, Thomas Shore, called A Step Away from Paradise, which recounts Droshik Lingpa's own journey to attempt to open this, climbing up a glacier and a snow wall on the east face of Kanchenjunga in an attempt to open a hidden land, and who tragically perished in an avalanche that occurred just as they were about to top out of this snow gully. So in any case, that was, since I had a background in climbing, I was very excited about the very dangers that were involved in the quest for hidden lands. And this is going over a pass into Pemaku, a few years after I heard about them. You can see in the center there, my friend with the hat, Hamid Sardar, who took almost all of the same journeys that I made into Pemaku. He was there as well. So these were extraordinary journeys, and involving, as you can see, these kinds of extraordinary terrain in which the hidden lands lie. And yet there are also places that are described in these texts going back to the 8th century. The texts describing hidden lands are attributed to Padmasambhava, the great Mahasiddha who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet. And I spent years searching out remote monasteries and places where there were actual physical texts describing the Beyul, as they're called, or the hidden lands in the Tibetan tradition. This is actually at a remote hermitage monastery in near Samagaon in the Manaslu region of northern Nepal, where there's a hidden land called Kimalung. And the text that this particular Lama was looking for me to describe the coordinates of that particular hidden land of happiness, as Kimalung means. So this is really just to point out from my book, The Heart of the World, about the scrolls that describing, or we can really call them texts describing Beyul, and how they lead us into wonder, for their accounts of processes in the mind as much as in the external world. And there's no real separation or boundary between ourselves and the world around us. And an ever-present wildness and radiance lies at the heart of our tamas vistas. So this is really a kind of synopsis, I suppose, of what the hidden lands are really referring to in terms of practice. But then when we look at the texts themselves, from a scroll, a text discovered by Lama Rinzin Demchen in 1366, who writes, as you can read here, those who contemplate journeying to the hidden lands often fall prey to their doubts and lack the requisite courage, while those who are overly pious lack the means to open the way to these secret places. For all who lack the circumstances to enter the hidden lands, they will remain as imagined paradises. They will not manifest simply from idle talk. This is in a text that's attributed to Padmasambhava called the Outer Passkey to the Hidden Lands. And we see in the image here Padmasambhava in union with Yeshe Tsogyal, who was his Tibetan consort, who was considered really the first living Buddha in Tibet, and who was also responsible, according to tradition, for transcribing a lot of the hidden teachings of Padmasambhava, including those that describe the routes to these hidden lands. And so we can see this kind of sense of almost eroticized practice in which the passions are not rejected or renounced, but they're integrated on the path to enlightenment. And there's actually this amplification of the sensorium in order to be able to penetrate into those aspects of our consciousness that often lie hidden. So what we see here in the very nature of the hidden lands is a mode of perception, a mode of practice, and something that's ever available, because the hidden lands, as a lot of the oral teachings about them to say, they're not limited to those simply described in Padmasambhava's texts, but they actually refer to the very substrate nature of reality itself. So this is on one of the occasions in Tibet where I went to the Enlightenment Cave of Yeshe Tsogyal, where some of these early texts describing the hidden lands were first revealed, with a Lama here from Kham in eastern Tibet. Traveling there, he was going there to enter into retreat at the cave. This is on the way up. And this is actually the cave, which is the Enlightenment Cave of Yeshe Tsogyal. It's situated above 17,000 feet in central Tibet. And we see here Lector Dorje with his characteristic tantric shawl, red and white in color, as opposed to the more widely known sort of maroon robes worn by those following the Vinaya code of Buddhist monasticism. This is the kind of insignia, if you will, of the tantric path, in which the white and the red symbolizes the union of the male and the female, as well as the so-called red and white essences within the subtle body that the tantric completion stage practices engage and bring together ultimately into a transpersonal experience of Buddhahood. So these are also teachers that I met along the way. They were not just, like we saw with Lama Lector Dorje, also Ani Rigzen, who accompanied me on 2 trips to Pemaka. And we see her here with one of her disciples from central Tibet, Ani Pasang. And again, this perpetuation of the tantric path, which is so different and less known for many than the monastic traditions of Tibet. And again, we see in this image of Padmasambhava in union here, not with Yeshe Tsogyal, but Mandarava, who was his Indian consort, who was a Indian princess. But again, in an extraordinary landscape. And here we can see the way Tibetan art, in a way, invokes this numinosity of the human emotions and of the passions when they are freed from the ignorance, greed, and aggression, and all of their permutations that, in a sense, keep us within a more diminished sense of our own potential and possibilities. But this sense here in this image is the detail from a larger scroll painting or tanka, these great mountains, these sentinels that are somehow part of our human imagination, of how the landscapes themselves reflect this journey into the deepest parts of our own nature. And again, we see that on the right there with the ladder kind of, as it were, going up the cliff, and to the Lama who's meditating there with the mountains and waterfalls above him. You see another example in Tibetan art, for example, of Mahasiddha in a landscape with his consort, invoking on this the ram's antler here, the evoking the flow from the elements, and the elements here depicted in rainbow colors, representing the very fact that we understand the engagement with the elements in tantric practice, that they're not only physical aspects of earth, water, sky, and air and wind, but they're also those elements within our own psychophysical organism that ultimately are of the nature of light and rainbow light. So again, we can see some of those things coded within tantric Buddhist art. We also see it in Western art, as shown here by Nicholas, in a painting by Nicholas Roerich called The Search for Shambhala. Nicholas Roerich was an extraordinary Russian explorer and mystic who spent many years in the Himalayas searching for the earthly coordinates of Shambhala, which I'm sure many of you have heard of as being, in a certain sense, this hidden kingdom that was evoked first in the Buddhist context within the Kailash Tantra in the beginning of the 11th century. And in a certain sense, what the hidden lands represent, as we'll be exploring further in the talk, as in a way more proximately accessible satellites, if you will, of Shambhala. And we, of course, see also how this idea of Shambhala, this idea of the hidden lands, was expressed within the context of Shangri-la, which was evoked first by the English writer James Hilton in a novel called Lost Horizon that was then turned into a film in the 1930s. As I'm sure many of you are aware, tells the story of these people whose plane crashes in a remote part of the Himalayas, and they enter into a kind of promised land, a sanctuary where the best of East and West has been preserved. And the book was unique, and the film were unique in the sense that they both came out in the 1930s during the height of the Great Depression, and they again represented during a period where people were very much kind of where travel and possibilities of life seemed diminished. These represented an extraordinary kind of ways of escape into some of the deepest yearnings, one could argue, of the human spirit. So my journeys to these proximate paradises, these hidden lands, included exploring those said to lie in Nepal, in this case up in the region of Khumbu, near Mount Everest. This is at a place called Gokyori, which according to old Tibetan text is in fact a portal to one of these paradises. And also to the land that I mentioned called Kimalong, the Beyul Kimalong, the hidden land of happiness in the Manaslu region of northern Nepal. And here we see a Buddhist stupa, that you walk through stupa, as it were, into this extraordinary valley called Serang. And I was traveling there, you can see, with a group of pilgrims, where their pack baskets going up to this rather amazing sanctuary that is described in early texts attributed to Padmasambhava. And here we see examples of early Tibetan explorers, in this case, a lama from Golok on the left, dressed as a Mahasiddha, or undressed, you could say, as a Mahasiddha. This is somebody that Chatra Rinpoche had met, actually, in the Darjeeling region. I'm not sure which decade that would have been, but he was there. I write about that a bit in the book, The Heart of the World. And then we can see on the upper left, from the same valley of Kimalong, this is the view down from the upper reaches of the valley with the Manaslu Himal in the background. And this was the view from up just above the cave that I stayed in there for a month. So as I said, there's a section of the book, The Heart of the World, called A Curriculum of Caves, in which Chatra Rinpoche continued to send me to these caves in various Beyul and to practice. And I would come back and sort of report my experiences, and then he'd send me off to another one. This was this kind of very, very wonderful apprenticeship that I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to experience. But hidden lands lie all the way through, and in places that are also in Tibetan tradition called Ne, or powerful places. This is the south wall, the sanctuary of Mount Kailash in western Tibet. It's also near the source of the Brahmaputra River, which is called the Tsangpo in Tibet, and flows across the southern edge of Tibet, and then makes this great bend at the eastern terminus of the Himalayas, around a mountain called Namche Barwa, making its descent down into this greatest of all the hidden lands, called the land of Pemaku, hidden land of Pemaku, meaning the land arrayed like a lotus. So I show this here because this then shows where, after those headwaters of the Tsangpo, this is showing the convoluted nature of the Tsangpo Gorge that flows between that rock ridge that you see in the middle of this photograph. Behind that is the depths of the gorge, then with these ice walls of Namche Barwa rising up above it. Then it makes another great bend to the left, and then flows again in this hairpin between the silhouetted ridge that you see in front and the rock ridge behind. Just to show the nature of how extraordinarily sealed from the ordinary world these hidden lands can be, in Pemaku in particular. So this was a map that I made of Pemaku, and you can see there where it says Tibet, where the E is. If you just go directly above that, you can see the great bend of the Tsangpo River and Namche Barwa right above, just to the upper left of the E is Namche Barwa. And then anyway, this was an unmapped area. So this was my attempt to sort of put some of the key sacred sites into map form as I continued to make journeys there every year for a number of years. And the texts are quite extraordinary because they describe it on the one hand as being a kind of proximate paradise of Padmasambhava, a earthly exemplar, if you will, of his copper-colored paradise that you see on the left, the Sangdo Pelri, as well as the paradise, the Kachari paradise, Shinkam, as we call in Tibetan, of Vajrayogini in her form of Vajravarahi, with the sow's head protruding from the upper right part of her head. So this is, again, a landscape that's understood and visualized, or experienced rather, and envisioned as the earthly terrestrial manifestation of a Buddhist goddess. And here we see, not only is it just the landscape, the body of Vajravarahi, but it's the body of Vajravarahi in union with Tamdring, with Hayangriva. And it's again this kind of eroticized landscape, signifying the bliss and the power that can arise from engaging with this sublime, with these kind of awe-inspiring landscapes and dimensions of our own being that can bring us out of our conventional limitations, in which we renounce not the conventional world in the ordinary sense, but in the tantric sense, where we renounce our conventional way of seeing reality. So here we see the northern, this is the peak of Gallipoli, which is considered in Pemaku to be the crown chakra of the goddess Vajravarahi. We see here in a statue of Vajravarahi, that distinctive sow's head, Dorje Pamo, as she's known in Tibetan, that's protruding from the right side of her head. And we can see how that's really is echoed in this view of the summit of Gallipoli, where we see that, again, almost what looks like a sow's head protruding at the very, very top of the mountain itself. So this is, again, where the creation phase of Tantric Buddhism intersects with the way we look at nature itself, as well as our own nature. Because, of course, the pilgrim who would be seeing this would also be recognizing that this same phenomenology is within their own subtle body. And we see that figured here with that same sow's head protruding from a meditation diagram on the left, of showing the chakra system, the flows of energy within the subtle body, and then how that's depicted in the body of a yogin on the right in the chamber of the from a wall painting from the end of the 17th century, from the Lukang in Tibet, with this idea that the journey on this level is about awakening those flows of energy within our mind body. And so pilgrimage is not just about visiting holy sites, but it's about awakening the wisdom body. And we can see how that's also echoed in a lot of the Buddhist tantras. So, for example, in the Kailash Chakra Tantra, which states that places of pilgrimage are omnipresent. The whole cosmos is a pilgrimage site, as is the individual. So we see here, again, the Tsangpo River flowing down from Pemaku with Gallipoli here with that distinctive summit in the shape of Vajravarahi's head, visible in the upper right. And then the river itself, as it flows down through Pemaku, is likened to her central channel. So the central channel being that axis, that fluent axis upon which all of the chakras are and energy points, focal points of energy are said to lie. So as I mentioned, this is Ani Riktsang, who had spent almost 9 years in solitary retreat in Terdrum in central Tibet, and she made 2 journeys with me into Pemaku. An extraordinary being and a great Dzogchen practitioner who, as Desmond also mentioned, next month I'll be giving a course called Embodying Great Perfection, Actualizing the Innermost Essence of the Buddhist Tantras. And a lot of that really comes down to, is the view, meditation, and action, these sort of the base, the path, and the fruit, which are kind of the tripart ways in which Dzogchen is presented, the great perfection as it translates into. And Ani Riktsang is extraordinary in her own way, in which she would manifest Dzogchen in everyday life. And so I will be definitely in the context of that course, be talking about Ani Riktsang's own manifestation in the context of that particular, it'll be a 4-part course. So we're looking at view, meditation, action, and fruition. But a lot of that does relate to the hidden land, because the hidden land, of course, is ultimately referring to our naturally perfected state. So here we again see the ways in which the texts moderate our perception of reality in terms of the hidden lands themselves. This is partly blocked out on my screen, so I'm going to have to read it partly from recollection. But Aho, the secret land of Pemaku, pure realm of the Buddhas of past, present, and future. Just thinking of this place, I become joyful. Crystal glaciers adorn the sky, rain falls like nectar from the gods, and rainbows fill the valleys. Walled round by snow, cliffs, and jungle, this is the hidden land of Padmasambhava, is a place where fortunate beings can attain enlightenment. So this is Oregon Dorje Dranak in an ode, if you will, in a naik, as it would be called in Tibetan, or a guide to the hidden places of Pemaku, from the 19th century. But although he lived into the early 20th century, and this is a Tibetan scroll painting depicting him, again, in the kind of classic way in which the yogis of the Tibetan Tantra tradition are presented in their red and white robes with the meditation belt and the conch shell earrings and the ornaments, all of which, of course, are very distinct from what we see in the typical garb of monks and nuns, and again representing this much more kind of engaged approach to working skillfully with powerful emotions rather than actually taking refuge from them. So again, here we see that same kind of entry point into Pemaku. So I made a series of expeditions following this text, trying to as the text will say, as we move through those portals and energy, focal points of energy within the landscape, we come into sympathetic resonance with those same focal points of energy that are within our own subtle bodies. And so there's this whole idea of the outer inner, the secret, coming into a radical kind of union, which of course is what really that union of Hayangriva and Dorje Palma are representing on the most esoteric and secret level. And that's the level called Yangsang, or the innermost secret level, when the outer, inner, and secret come into this kind of complete union. And that's also held in the text to be Yangsang Pemaku, is the innermost secret part of Pemaku, which is also held to have a geographical analog, and therefore it has particular ways in which it can be accessed. So this is both in the textual tradition as well as in the oral tradition. And so these are the kind of landscapes one moves through while trying to sort of navigate between the texts and the landscape itself, often which was, of course, pathless. And this led us over the course of many journeys into these kind of extraordinary terrain in which one would kind of blissfully lose oneself. And it's very interesting. I just recently started reading a book by Rebecca Stolnit, and I just want to read, which I was compelled to get because of the title, which is called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. And on this particular occasion in Pamako, we were just absolutely lost. But she writes wonderfully about in that book about how to be lost is to be fully present, and to be fully present is to be capable of being in uncertainty and mystery. And one does not get lost, but loses oneself, with the implication that it is a conscious choice, a chosen surrender, a psychic state achievable through geography. So I would say that my journeys into Pamako, when one was fortunate enough to, in a way, choose to be consciously disoriented through the medium of landscape, and therefore to come into new levels and manifestations of one's own being, was really a powerful and meaningful way in which one approaches that innermost meaning of the hidden land as being synonymous with the innermost secret nature that is always present within us, and yet sometimes is veiled to us by our habits of perception. So also in Pamako, we see how its own protectors, in this case, Dorje Draksen, this riding on what appears almost like a Himalayan anaconda or a rock python, is invoked as the protector who, again, if one doesn't sort of abide by the way, if one falls prey to one's hopes and fears and all the other kind of things that would actually exclude us from our true nature or block that awareness, then Dorje Draksen is the protector that we must placate in order to move forward. And I think it's a wonderful image of him in this case, sort of garlanded its snakes. So as we, in this case, on the first journey into Pamako, went deeper and deeper into the gorges of the Tsangpo, where there was no path and there was no map, and there was only these guidebooks of Padma Baba attributed to him, at least, and to Yeshe Tsogyo having reputedly transcribed them. You can see the kind of terrain. So right when we were reaching the edge of where actually people had gone, there was this was a particular ritual that we had to do on the left called the lashing, where you would carve a notch in a stick for every year of your life, and you would leave it at this rock. And then you would climb up that notch log on the left and listen, put your ear to a hole in the rock for any prophecies from the Dakinis to gain some kind of guidance for the way ahead. And the idea is here that the kings may tell you, go back, there is no place for you here, or they might inspire you further, or they may be mute. In any case, this was considered a very, very powerful and important stage in order to engage both with, in the outer, inner, and secret levels of the hidden land. And then we can see how then moving forward, one of the last kind of parts of the path involved crossing, as you can see, this kind of abyss on a kind of half-rotted notched log as we moved deeper into the gorge. And it was, as the texts also describe, a place, as I said, of both bucolic leisure and primitive panic. I mean, there were all kinds of extraordinary mushrooms and poisonous plants, hallucinogenic plants in this case, and a Himalayan pit viper on the left, deadly. And so, of course, all of this is great support for mindfulness on many levels. But again, the landscape itself, sometimes subtropical, sometimes crossing over these ice ridges. In this case, a spur of Namche Barwa, as we entered again down into the depths of a tributary of the Tsangpo River, which here there was no path. We were lost and had to get across this raging current by building a bridge, by felling trees with the primitive apches, or machete-like knives that our porters had with them. They had never been to this part of the Tsangpo Gorge either. But it was a sense that we all shared of being on the threshold of great mystery and great possibility. And this is where an extraordinary text from the early 18th century by Leilung Dorji, who translates roughly as the delightful true stories of the supreme land of Pemaka. And he writes in literally, he had made this same journey through this same part of the gorge as we were making in this case. And he says, when journeying to these sacred places, fear naturally transforms into great splendor and remains perfectly at ease. A new spiritual awareness flares up in one stream of consciousness, a conception-free unity of bliss and emptiness. So here we see, an extraordinary evocation of the way in which traveling to hidden lands and through hidden lands and through adversity is a means for actually igniting that kind of primordial unity of bliss and emptiness through the medium of sometimes acute danger. But it also led, in our case, to this extraordinary passage through the wilderness to the first of habitated village that we came across, and then here the Tsangpo Gorge as it flows south towards the Indian border, in this case, a small village called Beyul, which was the first we had come across in almost a month. An extraordinary earthly paradise-like world. Here were children bathing naked in waterfalls and streams that then pour down, as you could see in the image before that waterfall in the distance, falling into the Tsangpo, its upper reaches, is where children were bathing like this. So it was really a vision of the earthly paradise in many respects, the sense of natural communion with nature. It was also a place where ancient Nyingma traditions of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism were in full force, here with mass dancers at a remote monastery. Not really a monastery, a lakang, meaning because they are actually very proud of the fact in Pemaka that they are no monks. Monks were not welcomed. These were nakpas. These were tantric practitioners. And here we can see the way in which this idea of transformation, transfiguration, in means and through the embodying of a transpersonal other, almost an avatar in this case of the Garuda. And those of you familiar with Dzogchen will know about the flight of the Garuda as a metaphor, really, for our nature. And the Garuda meaning not just the celestial hawk, but a being, a state of consciousness that with a single flap of its wings could traverse the entire universe. So here we see again this idea of transformation through these esoteric and arcane practices that were very much part of the Pemaku world. And we can see also the way this was kind of enacted in everyday life in this subtropical paradisical world. We came to a point where we reached a waterfall that had been seen in 1924 on an expedition by a British plant collector, Frank Kingdon Ward, and his primary patron at that time, Lord Corder, Jack Corder, who was at 24 at that time and lived in the castle in which I'm now living in the gatehouse, and which accounts for the unusual decor on the walls behind me. I'm actually in the porter's lodge of the castle. But this was the place that they were able to reach, in this case, just after 1924 turned into 1925, and they reached this point on the Tsangpo River, leaving a 10-mile stretch they were not able to reach, in which they had, it's a long story, which I won't go into in this talk, but which there had been envisioned a great waterfall that they believed would rival Niagara Falls in Africa, or Victoria Falls in Africa. This is Jack Corder at the age of 24 on that journey, and this is from the archives here at the castle, and showing some of the conditions through which he and Kingdon Ward traveled in 1924 and 1925 as they tried to make their way down the Tsangpo River, not in search of the hidden lands of Padmasambhava, but in search of this sort of mythic waterfall that had nonetheless been described in the context of texts that were describing the hidden lands, the Beyul. And this was a map that Kingdon Ward and Lord Corder produced at the end of their 1925 expedition, showing the section between A and B there at the center, which was the area they were not able to reach. So that, in addition to my interest in traveling down through, as it were, the subtle geographical landscape of Dorje Palmo, I was also very intrigued by this area between points A and B that Kingdon Ward and Lord Corder had not been able to reach, because it remained essentially an unknown area up until to our journey there about 20 years ago. So this was essentially the secret gate as it was described in the text. So this corresponded with the throat of Dorje Pomo. It was one of the routes into the hidden land, into the Yangsang Pemako and the innermost secret land. And 1 second, so Bakatuku Pemariksen, this is one of my teachers who is now currently based in the United States, but was at that time based in, and the time this picture was taken, in Bhutan, but was also based in Tibet for many of the journeys that I made into Pemako, traveling through Po, as it was originally called in Tibet. And he, in guiding me through the text, he said, well, if you want to reach that part of Pemako, the throat of Dorje Pomo and the gateway into the innermost secret land, you actually have to travel first to this mountain, Kundu Dor Sempetrong, which is the heart of Dorje Pomo. And that's where the key lies. And only by traveling to the heart, in a sense, can you travel, therefore, do you gain access through the throat into the innermost hidden land. So this led to an extraordinary journey, and this is on part of that journey. We traveled with a wonderful Lama Kawatuku and with a nun who you see here, who ate flowers most of the way. Extraordinary being. We're crossing over a pass from Po, which is, as I mentioned, where Bakatuku's monastery, originally called Baka Gompa, Baka Monastery, lies. Crossing over this Dashingla Pass into Pemako. And again, on the other side, these incredible sort of snowfields as you descend from these icy heights down into a subtropical world. Then crossing the river, in this case, the Chimdor River, on this kind of cable that had been put across this raging river that was a tributary flowing into the Tsangpo. We had to bring our whole expedition across this, and then crossing over intermediary passes like this one called the Zigchinla, the Great Leopard Pass. So all these are stories that are written about at much length in the book, The Heart of the World, different sections of it. And the travels, in this case, this is in the section called The Mountain. And we traveled with Kawatuku, who's kind of hidden behind his attendant here, this young monk who helped carry his gear. He was in quest of 5 magical plants that are described in the Pemako, some of the Pemako texts. And that led to this amazing journey that coincided with our own journey to the heart center of Dorje Pomo to seek the key in order to enter into the innermost secret land, together with Kawatuku, who was seeking out the 5 magical plants that themselves were also, you could say, plant keys into that innermost dimension and world. So there's quite a bit written about that in the text and of the Heart of the World. So I don't think we have time to go into it too much here, but I'm happy to explore that more in the question and answer period. It meant crossing through this extraordinary high altitude bog. This is about 10,000 feet up high. Unbelievable. It looks rather benign, but it wasn't. But we spent a day trying to get through, wading across these mud flats, as it were. And eventually, to see the mountain there in the upper right, this anvil-shaped peak of Kundador Sempetrong, surrounded by 8 lakes, Kage Lake. So it's a mandala in a geographical form with the 8 lakes connected with 8 tantric deities, and there are rituals to be done at each of the lakes. As you made your way around the mountain first, you circumambulated it in order to be able to then move to the center of the mandala. And so this is the heart of Dorje Pomo, and therefore it was the heart of Tapak, as it's called. So this is Dorje Pomo, or Vajravarahi, in union with Hayangriva, Tamding, as it's translated in Tibetan. And this is Hamid there, what ended up being a rather classic image of this idea of what lies beyond. This was always what called us on these journeys, was really the sense of just being at the edge, a threshold of something always more about to be. So we get to the mountain finally, and we get to the lake. And this is actually a quote from one of the texts attributed to Padmasambhava called A Guide to the Heart Center. Is the Naik, the heart center here, referring to the Ning of Dorje Palma and Eingriva, as I mentioned. It says, whoever washes and drinks from this lake can purify lifetimes of karmic defilements and pacify the obstacles and disturbances of this life. So these were kind of the kind of encouraging words that the texts that guided the pilgrim into extraordinary terrain. And this may look rather benign, but this was almost like a month of journeying to get to this place, which is which is a whole story in itself. And as I said, a lot of this I go into detail in the book, The Heart of the World. But again, here's again a passage from that particular text that guided us here in this instance. As you can read there, the most fortunate beings will perceive the deities. And again, it's blocked by my screen, so I'll let you read it yourselves. But the idea here being, of course, that only when your vision and your perception on all levels is completely clarified will you perceive this as the Kundu Dorsen Potrang, which literally means Kundu is the all-gathering Potrang, citadel of Vajrasattva. So Vajrasattva envisioned here in union as the representation of bliss and emptiness, which is in a certain sense the essence of all tantric yidams, tantric deities shown in ecstatic union, representing that kind of marriage, as it were, the alchemical marriage that takes place within our own subtle anatomy, in which that bliss and emptiness which is our fundamental nature, becomes the default mode, as opposed to something that we have to in any way seek out. It becomes actually what we are and always have been. So here was Kabatuku at the place where the text described was the route up the cliff to find where the key lay. Here another manifestation of Vajravarahi in her kind of magnetizing form as Kurukula. And these were all kind of emanations of the goddess. And then from here, and again, I'm just going to, I think with time, 1 second. I'll move a little bit quicker. Here we reach the navel of Dorje Palma, which is at the place called Rinchen and again, through an extraordinary set of circumstances, this rainbow appeared as we arrived in this navel-like center of in the landscape. And we, again, under sort of extraordinary circumstances, came to this manifestation. This is a larger-than-life statue of Padmasambhava in his form, not one of the typical 8 manifestations, but in this form, as Chaturanga Rinpoche said, this is Rangrik Gyalpo, meaning the king or the monarch of self-arising wisdom. And this is the form that Padmasambhava took at this time to subdue all negativity. Here again, we see Padmasambhava in union with Yeshit Sogyal in a Tibetan painting. But this was really, and also in this area, extraordinary animals that were said to be treasures of Padmasambhava, the takin. This is also a national treasure in Bhutan. But in this case, the takin were wild, very wild, also in this part of Pemaku. So the journey was not over in the sense that, whether or not we had the key or not, we had actually gone to the place where it was meant to be. So the journey then brought us back to the great bend of the Tsangpo, and we had to find a way across it. Here I'm crossing, so you can see kind of on a sort of improvised pulley system using a notched rhododendron a piece of rhododendron wood with a rope to pull over our gear. We decided that we would try to get into that 10-mile stretch that Lord Quarter and Kingdom Ward had not been able to reach in the 1920s. Here, again, we're using caving ladder and rappelling down, trying to follow this unbelievable contouring of the edges of the Tsangpo Gorge into its innermost recesses, into the area that the text described as being the throat. We weren't able, however, to reach a point further on this occasion than Kingdom Ward and Lord Carter reached. The Lama traveling with us did a chud ceremony there to appease any spirits that we might have unintentionally disturbed. And we sought other means and other ways into this innermost secret part of Pemaka, Yangsang Pemaka, one of which was to cross over this ridge in between. That turned out to be very, very difficult. We were this is one headman in one village who, basically advised us strongly not even to attempt it. But again, because of interest of time, I will kind of skip here to the Lama, Konshe Wongpo, who finally did admit that there was a way down into the innermost part of the gorge that he had said that there wasn't earlier. And that was because he'd heard about our journey to the mountain, Kundra Sempetrong, and he recognized us as therefore as Nangpa, as insiders in the tradition and not as outside explorers. So we were able to enter into Pemaka on its terms and with his support and guidance. Here he said he was too old to go, but he sent us into this area that, as I mentioned, was between points A and B on Lord Corder and Kingdom Ward's map, the area that they had not been able to reach. That where it says falls was that lesser falls that they had recognized, claiming that there was no greater falls in that section that they didn't reach. So we traveled into this area, sort of Batmaning down these kinds of vines that you see here that grew along slabs of rock, also using tufts of grass to kind of make our way down to this rather precipitous part of the gorge. There were extraordinary, just when the hunter guides who wanted to turn back, suddenly we got this very auspicious meteorological sign of these circular rainbows that occurred not just in one direction, but in three. And then the skies opened and we could see down into the very depths of the gorge, towards where we hoped would be a waterfall, such as had been sought by these earlier explorers. And we saw this foreshortened vision there, and eventually were able to rappel down to the base, and where the text described a gate, a tunnel leading into the rock behind the falls, which turned out to be basically opposite the falls, as you can see here. So again, suddenly we found ourselves gazing across at this tunnel in the rock, having no idea where it might lead. And yet a text attributed to the 8th century by Padmasambhava saying that if you went through that tunnel for a period of days, you would end on Yangsang Pemaka, the innermost secret paradisical dimension of this hidden land of Pemaka. So this was an area where, of course, that is the Yangsang Pemaka, as it shows above, this idea of moving through falling waters into different dimensions of reality, also a meditative practice. So again, it's not specifically that one would actually have to go through that tunnel. One could do it differently, finding that that tunnel was actually a portal or a doorway within one's own innermost being. And this would lead one into the innermost mandala of Dorje Palma, Vajravarahi, which is essentially inseparable from our own awakened nature. So the enlightened dancing form of the Buddha nature expressed in female form as this enlightened being of Dorje Palma, being the heart of the mandala, and in a certain sense, the heart of our innermost nature. So a matter of perception, and I'll just skip through a last few slides here before we take a momentary break and then go to some questions and answers. But I was very intrigued, not just to reach that point which would be one gate, but Bakatuku also said, well, that's only one door into Pemaka. There's also the lower door, which is more accessible, which lies in the area now in Arunachal Pradesh in India. And this was the area that corresponds in terms of Dorje Palma Vajravarahi's body with her uterine channel leading into her womb. And this is an area where there were still the Lopas, the Tibetans called them, the tribal peoples. In this case, the Idu Mishmi, as you can see here, this headman, who was our host as we tried to travel into the hidden land, finding this lower gate. Lelong Shepe Dorji tried to travel into this part of Pemaka in 1729, where he wrote in his memoirs that there's a constant menace here from poisonous snakes, leeches, flies, clawed and long-snouted animals with fangs, dangerous wild men and vicious savages. One can easily succumb to fever and gout, while blisters, abscesses, ulcers, and sores add to the physical obstacles. Those without courage are those with lingering doubts, too many mental conceptions, or who are strongly attached to conventional appearances, or who out of ignorance fall into accepting and rejecting. Such people will have difficulty reaching this land and getting through unscathed. So an amazing and beautiful teaching about how to navigate not just hidden lands, but life itself. And this is, of course, in Pemmica, where these things were ever-present realities. And here the ubiquitous Himalayan pit viper, which one definitely would keep one very present and awake while walking through such terrain. But this was all part of this magical land of the Dakini, in this case of Dorje Pommel, in her various Dakini emissaries. The Idu Mishmis, who then guided us, and it's a long story, which we can talk about on maybe in question and answers. It turned out they had their own gateway into a paradise of their own that happened to be the same as the lower gate that the Tibetans envisioned in this lower part of Pemmica as the gateway into Yangsang Pemmica. And these are from a different tribe in the area. There's also this area of extraordinarily the not just the magical plants, but the healing plants, medicinal plants. This is a young woman from the Adi tribe, which is along with the Idus, the main two indigenous peoples of this area that Tibetans interacted with when they first came into this region in search of their own promised land. They found, in fact, a land that was already an earthly paradise for its indigenous inhabitants. And here we see women of the Adi tribe who traveled with us on our search to find the door that the Tibetan text described at a place called Traka Dorje Chuzong, which was, according to many lamas that we consulted with, was the actual gateway in the womb of Dorje Pommel into the innermost secret land. So this is with them coming back into these extraordinary subtropical jungles with the high snow peaks above us, and my hosts here on that occasion. And lastly, just leaving you with a couple images from Bhutan and the sacred places there. As mentioned by Desmond at the opening to this talk, I will be, and I think there are a number of people here in this talk who will be joining Lama Michael Gregory and me. We'll be co-leading a trip to Bhutan that will be starting out with a 2-week retreat just below this what we see here, and then which is the Sengyedzong, the lioness fortress where Yeshe Tsogyal stayed in retreat with one of her consorts, Atsetsale, and the Shekar Chu, the Bapchu, the white crystal waterfall. So after our 2-week retreat, we'll climb up to some of these incredible and practice at some of these incredible pilgrimage sites. So just leaving you with these last images and with a final quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in his introduction to the Heart of the World, where he writes that hidden lands are not places to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply. The qualities inherent in such sacred places reveal the interconnectedness of all life and deepen awareness of the hidden regions of the mind and spirit. Visiting such places with a good motivation and appropriate merit, the pilgrim can learn to see the world differently from the way it commonly appears. So I'll just end, because of interest of time, I'll stop here and we can go to some question and answers. And as I said, I'm very happy to stay on kind of beyond the next 30 minutes, because I think now there's only 20 minutes for question and answers. So I will end the screen sharing here, and we'll go back to here. And as Desmond said, he would be kind of scrolling through the questions and be very happy to answer to whatever degree I'm able to. So thank you all for being present here for this talk.
Ian, that was a lovely talk. Thank you very, very much indeed. Again, very engaging and fascinating. And one would like to know much, much more, but we've got a little bit of time to find out. But looking at all those wonderful photographs and everything you were saying about the way that one merges into the landscape, reminded me of going into one of the national parks in America, which is staggeringly beautiful. But there was an enormous sign on one of them that said, entering such and such a park, I won't say which one it was, land of many uses. And you know, this is what we're like, isn't it? We just think we can use the land or exploit it, or you chop the trees down and use them for timber and dig the ground up and, you know, sell it, sell the jewels and minerals below it. But you're at one with the land here.
Yeah.
Some very, very interesting questions here.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go straight to them because you don't want to hear my comments, but really, but things that people have to say.
Sure.
And it's really starts off with a very interesting questions here from Jens Nastrom. He said, Dr. Baker points out that these power places are not limited to the Himalayas. However, can we discover and relate to or engage with places where we live? I'm not expecting full Beyuls, but places of power more generally. And then this is echoed again by another question from Carmela. As you mentioned, the presence of hallucinogenic, no, not that one, that'll come later. And that is that she says, the questioner says, it's very interesting listening to these talks about these wonderful places, but I live in a little village in England, and how can I find something to equal?
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two questions are very sort of closely related, actually.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And if I would comment, it would be that, yeah, the Beyul, just like is, and the gateway into Yongsan Pemaka is really everywhere. It's really what hides it is our habits of perception. And it's simply that places that, like the Beyul that you see here, with the intensity of the landscape, the intensity of the elements, the wildness, it comes into kind of sympathetic resonance with those elements in our own being, and therefore it becomes, and for some of us, you know, easier to suddenly recognize that this profound interconnectivity that pervades everything and anything when we are in the presence of wildness on this level. And when we think again of to go, you know, back to your evocation of American wilderness or national parks, you know, in Thoreau's famous comment that in wildness, not in wilderness, in wildness is the preservation of the world. And it's that wildness, that inner wildness, as well as its outer part, is so essential for us to connect with. And yet that doesn't mean that if we're in a small village in England or anywhere in in Kansas or who knows where, it doesn't mean that we don't have access to all that we have access to, let's say, when we embark on journeys into the deepest parts of the earth and the Himalayas or Patagonia or wherever else it might be. I mean, and William Blake, of course, the great English poet, is a reminder of that when he talks about the doors of perception are hidden only by our habits of perception, and that, you know, we can see heaven in a grain of sand, you know, and hold eternity, you know, in a flower. And it's this idea that really, when we are awake and awakened, I mean, here William Blake was experiencing it, you know, on the peripheries of Oxford, you know, without seemingly chemical support of anything else other than just a mystic disposition. And of course, the whole idea of the search for hidden lands is about really cultivating a mystic disposition. It's really something that we see in the Tibetan tradition called danang, which means literally sacred vision or pure perception. And it's really inseparable from the Dzogchen view, which is really to recognize, which is really a disposition of non-duality, in which we recognize that we are inseparable from all that which we perceive, which is both a projection of us, just as we are a projection of it, so there's no separation. And this is the pure vision that guides us through the terrain so that we don't fall sway to the hope and fear, which of course are the great guardians, that even in mystical Christian tradition are what, the cherubim that prevent us from regaining Eden are those very aspects of our egoic mind that prevent us from identifying with, the God mind, if you will, the transcendental consciousness, which is the paradisical condition from which we fell when we fell into the impulses and agendas of the ego. And of course, we see parallels with that in any mystical tradition, but it's certainly very present within the Beyul story. So these ideas of places of power, they're everywhere and can be recognized literally. Again, I think Blake is a great example to just reread, his Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which in a way is also a guide to navigating between the extremes of experience and to recognize that everything and anything, any blade of grass, any stone that we look at in the right way, particularly up here in Scotland, they call it scrying, where you can just look at a certain reflection in water or on a leaf in the gloaming, as it is this type of time of year, and you begin to see portals opening. And then one can follow those leads as it is, into a more encompassing experience of reality.
Ian, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It reminds me that, from the Bible story, the entrance into paradise is protected by, once one has left it, by an angel with a fiery sword. So it's not so easy to get back there. And your talk illustrates that very beautifully. But to go on with the questions from the floor, you mentioned hallucinogenic plants. Were these used in tantric practice? That's from Susan. And then another one, which is from Carmela, which I mentioned earlier. As you mentioned, the presence of hallucinogenic plants, I'm curious to know how influential or spread was the use of hallucinogenic plants in the practice of tantric Buddhism.
Yep. I'll comment on that. There are a couple ways. A book of mine that came out a couple of years ago called Tibetan Yoga, Principles and Practices. There's a chapter in that called Potent Solutions, which explores the use of psychoactive plants in the context of the Buddhist Tantras. So to sort of just make it simple, we can see that so many of the practices of the completion stage of Tantric Buddhism, such as Tummo, which as directly correlates with Kundalini practices and the Shaiva Shakta traditions of Tantric Hinduism, are shared between the traditions. So it's no mystery that the Kaula tradition and the Shakta and Shaiva traditions of Tantric Indian Tantra are deeply infused with supportive psychoactive and psychedelic substances. So it would be strange to think that these same substances weren't part of the esoteric, you could say, oral tradition in Tantric Buddhism as well. But it's not only in the oral tradition that we see it. We also see it in very specifically spoken about, or written about rather, in the Mahakala Tantra is one specific one. Even the Chanda Maharoshna Tantra speaks very explicitly of the use of psychedelic substances to support recognition of the illusory body on the one hand. And it's also in the Dzogchen tradition. We can see it in some of the Dzogchen termas, such as the Vimanintik, in which there's a preparation made from the boiled seeds of datura and goat milk that are then introduced into one's eyes by through an eagle or a vulture's quill, in order to induce the kind of visionary states that one can ideally induce without it, but it can be a way of getting a quick preview of the kind of visionary experiences that can arise simply through contemplative practice. So again, I would, for anybody who's interested in that, there's also a lot of, so there's a whole chapter devoted to it called Potent Solutions in Tibetan Yoga, but there's also quite a bit that I write about it in the context of the Heart of the World, where I talk about the particular treasure revealers such as Dorje Tome, whose texts go into great detail about the 5 magical plants.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, it is interesting because I was vaguely involved with the Maudsley, hospital, which are using psilocybin now to treat resistant depression.
Mhm.
The thing about depression is everything sort of closes down, your sensory capacity closes down, and you just become kind of obsessed with very gloomy thoughts. And of course, hallucinogenics tend to reverse that process. So you come to your senses first, kind of hear things more clearly, and then the emotional thing starts. And then you get into the realm of just, pure experience, which can be very terrifying and also very pleasant. But it seems to, in some people, um, cause quite dramatic changes in their states of mind, which persist for many, many months afterwards. I'm not recommending that people use these things, without a kind of thinking carefully about it, because of course can be quite dangerous. But people are beginning to use it now quite
Yeah.
safely. But more importantly than that, I was talking to someone from Johns Hopkins who's been using hallucinogenics, or LSD actually, since the 60s, and he said, the real thing about it is that it gives people a profound sense of meaning. He said that's really the thing, apart from opening up and feeling things. He said it's the profound sense of meaningfulness, that really changes people.
Yes.
So their life has some purpose. You don't need a purpose. It actually has meaning, being
Mhm.
alive. And
Yeah.
I thought that was really significant in
Very,
the context of what we're talking about. Actually.
very, very much so. I think all of this is really what the Hidden Lands are about. It's a way in which we infuse our everyday experience with something that partakes of our deepest, what give us the greatest meaning, which is, in a sense, if we could call it that Edenic condition from which, at least in Western mythos, we've fallen into a world in which meaning is not always present to us. And yet when we're in the Edenic state, the question doesn't even arise because we're so completely at one with experience.
Yeah, perhaps it's related to the word, logos, or the sort of central meaning of logos.
Sure.
But anyway, to go back to the questions,
Mhm.
what original sources can you recommend that talk about the hidden lands? For example, are there any translations of Padmasambhava's texts on this subject? That's from Albrecht Seeger.
Yeah.
There's another one from Albrecht. As Western Buddhist practitioners who cannot go to Asia, what can this topic do for us if we are nevertheless very attracted to the topic?
Mhm.
Again from Albrecht. And then another one from Albrecht. Are there items that have been brought to our world from this hidden land? And have you seen some items, Ian? So is there some kind of exchange?
Yep. Okay, let me address some of that, and I'm going to because you're fielding the questions for me, for which I'm very grateful. But it will mean that there are a lot of questions, and I can just sort of see generally that there are a lot of direct questions to me, which I'm not in a position to answer. But what I really want to mention right now, before I answer the question that you just posed, that I would be really happy to hear from anybody who's trying to direct message me, and to whom I cannot respond. But please email me, and the easiest way would be ianbaker108@gmail.com, and I'd be really happy to hear from anybody and to try to answer any of the direct questions. There's some questions I can see that are about the nature of the trip to Bhutan, for example, and whether that's still a possibility and open, and I can talk then in that context about the fact that we'll probably be doing the trip not only this April, but again in October and the next year. So I want to mention that these are ways in which, in a certain sense, the hidden land can be engaged from the West by actually going to places where the hidden lands are a very present part of national agenda. In Bhutan, for example, it's the only country in the world that's carbon negative, and in a certain sense it's actually bringing about the vision of an earthly paradise into its national operating system, its gross national happiness. So I think this is something really profound in the way that going to a place like Bhutan can be so inspiring to show us how a country where Tantric Buddhism is the state religion, as it were, but which has therefore an environmental ethic that is completely in unison with the ideals presented by the Beyul, hidden lands. And there are many hidden lands in Bhutan, some of which are accessible and some of which are very specifically held to be connected with the life force of the royal family, and nobody can go to. They're sealed, which is wonderful. They are sanctuaries for, the Royal Bengal tiger. They are places which, in a way, are pristine wilderness that no human beings can travel to. Although they're also held to be places that are not only full of tigers and bears, but also migu, kind of the Yeti. So they're places where the imagination can run wild, even if one can't visit them physically. So Bhutan is very inspiring. So anyway, as I said, for anybody who has written directly about anything to do with Bhutan or the course next month or anything to do with this talk, please do copy your email, or copy your message in the chat and email me instead. And then I'll just try to use the remaining time to address some of the questions that Desmond's kindly bringing forth. So the question there really was about, well, what do we do if we can't, make the journey physically? And I think that's really the key point here, is that the journey doesn't need to be made physically. When we look, for example, at the stories of Shambhala and the guides to Shambhala from the Panchen Lama, for example, the sixth Panchen Lama, those journeys were made through meditation. They were made through a contemplative process. They didn't involve the Panchen Lama leaving Tashi Lumpo in central Tibet and going off on a wild expedition into the north frontier towards the Mongolia, but actually what he was able to accomplish by going inward, so that the way to the hidden land was actually affected by going into deeper strata of our own consciousness, our own minds. And that's another, and I think what speaks to that best is another epigraph I used in The Heart of the World from Simon Schama, which I think speaks to this so well. I'm just going to open up that page where Simon Schama writes that although we are accustomed to separate nature and human perception into two realms, they are in fact indivisible. Landscape is the work of the mind. Its scenery is built as much from strata of memory as from layers of rock. So in other words, we remember these sacred places, not necessarily by having to travel to them physically, but by remembering them, by reconstructing them within our psyches, by actually recognizing that we're never separate from them. And this is where the practice of the elements, the 5 elements, which are so critical in early Buddhism, as well as particularly in the original preliminary practices for Dzogchen, which we'll talk about in the course next month, the Rushen practices, where you're going through the 5 elements, and the elements are in a way the portals into that radical synergy and sympathetic resonance that we have with all of external nature, which we think of as external nature, but it's an interconnected totality. So as I said, we can access the hidden lands in that sense directly through our own body. And through the wisdom body and through these centers that are simultaneously within and without. We talk in alchemy about what as above, so below, but in the kind of ethos of the Beyul, it's really about as without, so within. And therefore, the way into this primordial nature is by discovering those technologies of body, mind, and breath that can bring us more deeply into our own innermost being.
Thank you, Ian. Can you go over a little bit over time?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not really in any problem. I'm happy to stay here for, really, I know a lot of people have had to leave. I can see that, but I'm happy to stay here for another 10, 15 minutes if that is useful.
That'd be very nice, Ian.
Sure, very happily.
Those of you who are going, thank you so much for joining us, and please make use of the Buddhist Society as much as you can. There's all sorts of really good things here, food for the soul. So it'll be nice to see you again. But now we'll go on with some other questions. Yes, this is from Frank. I've been to Bhutan many times, and I'm wondering if Ian is familiar with the writings of the Scottish writer Neil Gunn on the other landscape.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. I'm Neil Dunn. I'm not aware of Nan Shepherd. I am certainly, who wrote, of course, wonderfully called the what's her name of her book on the Cairngorms. But Neil Dunn, no. So I'd be interested to know, how is that being spelt in the.
Neilgunn.
Okay, I will look for that for sure. And I just did see kind of a message there whether I could repeat my email address if it wasn't clear. So just to repeat it, it's my name, all small letters, Ian Baker, and then 108, kind of the magical numerology of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, gmail.com. That's the simplest way to reach me. There are other emails that I have, but that is, I think, the easiest one. Yeah, there we got it. I see. Thank you for entering
another one pertinent to your last few remarks, about to Bhutan and so on. Do you need to be exceptionally fit to do the journeys you are arranging to Bhutan? In other words, someone wanted to join some of your retreats.
Sure. No, that's a very important and very, very helpful question. So no, absolutely not. We have, for the people who've already joined, there are 30 people, which was originally the limit, but it's a little flexible. So there's still possibility to join. But there is no real limitation based upon personal fitness, because we will always have options, A, B, and C, for example. And first of all, the first 2 weeks are going to be retreat within retreat cabins that have outside compounds. So obviously there's no limitation there. And then during the pilgrimage period, these will be day excursions, but where some of them may be more arduous, there'll be ones where some may go partway, but we will always be accommodating everybody's level of fitness, and as well as people's levels of background in terms of practice through the exposure to the different teachers who will, from Bhutan, who will be supporting the retreat and the pilgrimage period. So people will have, again, don't have to be concerned about whether or not they've had sufficient background in Buddhism or the 6 yogas or Dzogchen. It's like that. It's really, the view that Lama Michael Gregory and I have is that when we're talking about Dzogchen, which translates into English language as great perfection, it's really the default mode of our own mind. We talk so much about the default mode network as being something ruminative and less than optimal, and that mindfulness is trying to bring us out of. But in the tantric view, where it's actually, we go beyond mindfulness, and what we do in going beyond mindfulness is to access a default mode that's actually an alternate mode, which is really Rigpa, which is the state of absolute sheer awareness, which is free of any kind of afflictive thought and emotion. All of that's there, and yet it's not something that's identified with, and therefore it's looked upon as something that is optional in the certain sense that we can opt out of it. And that's really the process of Chiksha, of cutting through to the primordial nature. So in that respect, it's you could say a more radical approach to the presentation of teachings. Lama Michael Gregory is, I think, very visionary in the way that he's been able to approach the material in a very traditional way, and at the same time to be able to adapt it to kind of contemporary circumstances and conditions in the world and to individuals in the world. So I think it's going to be a very exciting opportunity. And the other thing I'd just say lastly that will be so unique is that Bhutan is really, when we're there and we come out from the retreat period, we'll probably be the only foreign tourist group in Bhutan. So it'll be a bit like stepping back in time several decades to when there really was no tourism in Bhutan. So in that sense, the access that we'll have to the power places, the sacred places, will be exceptional.
Thank you, Ian. There's another question very specific to the retreat, and that says, can Dr. Baker talk a bit about the content of the coming 4-day workshop in February? Will there be practice sessions included?
Sure. Now that's important because it does, in a certain sense, relates, as we mentioned before, that hidden lands are really just a way of accessing our innermost nature. And the 4 days are essentially originally 4 Saturdays, except for one Saturday isn't possible for me. So we've changed that to a Wednesday. But in between those sessions that are offered every once a week, essentially, there will be practices and an orientation. So it's looking at in a certain sense, it's a history of Dzogchen, but it's an experiential introduction to Dzogchen in a way I think that hasn't really been presented so much this way in the past. It's also going to be both text-based, but more than that, it really does, I think for the first time, and I've been very cautious about doing this in the past, but it does more and more seem to be appropriate to share to some sense of how I was guided through the Dzogchen path, which has elements of in the way Chatra Rinpoche had taught that perhaps are, I think, relevant to many people today seeking a way that cuts through a lot of the cultural conditioning in which Dzogchen to some degree has been packaged over the many centuries, because we can see obviously in the history and evolution of the Dzogchen tradition that it has evolved, and there's no reason that it shouldn't be continuing to evolve now. So in that respect, I'll be sharing some of the perspectives that Chatra Rinpoche or even Dudjom Rinpoche shared about that process. And but it will be at the same time really grounded in the traditional texts that first describe Dzogchen as it first appears in the Garba Tantra, for example, which Bakatuku Rinpoche gave the transmission for and spoke about in a way, just as a teaser, let's just say. He says, if you really understand and receive the Garba Tantra, there's no way you can be a monk. And therefore, there's no way that you can practice Dzogchen. So that's a rather radical statement, I know, but I say it only because, on one level, please don't take it literally. It just simply means that when we look at Dzogchen in its earliest iterations, it's a very radical formulation that cuts even through even the discourses of Vajrayana Buddhism. And it only was sort of slowly over the centuries reintegrated back into Vajrayana because it was radical to the point where it was in danger of being, ostracized. But I think it's important for contemporary practitioners to recognize really where it came from. So part of what I'll be doing in that you could say a 4-week course is looking at its origins in Udiyana, the place where Padmasambhava is said to come from. We can see its antecedents in the teachings of Sahaja, the state of just innate naturalness that Indrabhuti, that Lakshmankara, female Mahasiddha, all write about in early texts. And these were held to be contemporaries of Padmasambhava, although sometimes the dates don't line up simplistically, but we can see in this the antecedents of Dzogchen is as a state that is in a way analogous to, or even inseparable from, as many Dzogchen masters would say, with essence, Mahamudra, as presented by the Mahasiddhas. So that's really kind of the general content. Otherwise, you can go to the Contemplative Consciousness Network website, which I think has been posted there, and that will give you a detailed overview of the course and of the 4 different course components. And as I said, I'll be kind of interweaving within that actually the Beyul and the practices and how nature is taken as the path, which is a very strong component in early ways in which Dzogchen was presented. In other words, it wasn't just a practice of the mind and the mind nature. It was a very deeply embodied way of engaging with our full sensorium through immersion in nature and the kind of changes and transformations that arise through that. And that's how I was taught. And it's also when we look at a lot of the early texts, including, the Dratel Jur and other of the 17 Dzogchen Tantras, and these were highly embodied practices. So I think what I'll be doing in this is looking at that so that we don't mistake Dzogchen for just being a kind of mental attitude, which I think is to do it a disservice. So any other questions that relating either
Well,
to this?
I assume, Ian, that your retreat coming up in Bhutan is probably booked up, but were people
Well, not necessarily. I mean, Lama Michael and I have talked about that, and we feel, and we've also talked about the those who will be facilitating it in Bhutan, and so people are welcome to write to me at my email address, and it's they're. I'll just say right off, I just have to say at the outset, a couple people who were signed up for it have had to bail on it because Bhutan has a very strict policy that no one will be allowed in who hasn't been fully vaccinated, meaning a double vaccinated. I don't think they require the triple, but that is a limitation for anybody who has chosen not to receive a vaccination, and also because the transit point for the Bhutan trip is Thailand, and that they have the same regulations. So for anybody who isn't vaccinated, it really wouldn't be possible to join the trip now. I mean, these circumstances may change by next fall or certainly by next year, so one can stay posted about it, but that's an absolute limitation, not one set by us, but by current global policy.
And does one have to worry about things like pulmonary edema and mountain sickness?
No, it's very different than traveling to Tibet, where you fly into Lhasa at about 11,500 feet, whereas you fly into Paro, you're at about 8,000 feet. It's not high enough to be anything. One will feel maybe a little bit of, not breathlessness, but that one's at a little bit of a higher altitude. But one never really at that point. It's above 10, according to all of the mountaineering textbooks, as it were. It's above 10,000 feet where one begins to be concerned about going from sea level to 10,000. And flying into Lhasa in Tibet, which I've taken many, many groups to Tibet, no one's really ever had any serious problem except for one. And she did have to fly back. But that I said, that was flying into a height of almost 2,000 feet higher. So Bhutan won't be a problem that way. We'll be spending the first 2 weeks at about that altitude, and then for the periods in which we're visiting some of these power places and holy sites that are up higher, will be well acclimatized during that second week period. So
there you are. Anyone in the audience who wants to come, here it is. You'll be safe and sound.
Yeah. As I said, we can't guarantee that there'll be space. We have to visit that. But as I said, now that we've reached kind of a critical number, I think we're able to go a little higher because those in Bhutan have assured us that isn't a problem. But please do write about it, and then we can look at it, what the circumstances are.
There's one last question, actually, I think probably we should leave it at this
okay.
point. Mm-hmm. It's from Thubton, and he says, I read Ian's book about his journey to Pemmican, and I was not quite clear about the end result. Ian reached a place after rappelling down, and then what were Ian's experience and understanding after reaching the final location? What did Ian learn or see at the end of that journey?
Well, I shared some of that, I think, in the talk, but if I was to summarize that, this is really where the book ends. We came to a point at the base of a waterfall that had been imagined for well over a century and had been the source of great geographical speculation in the Western imagination, particularly in the Royal Geographical Society. We found that this waterfall, did actually exist. We were able to measure it by two different means. We'd brought the equipment for that. We were able to have the mountaineering equipment to reach the base, found that it did qualify, as a waterfall of 100 feet or more, which was the criteria that Kingdom Ward and Lord Corder had laid out in the 1920s, and actually had been laid out earlier than that by Bailey and Mooreshead, for those who are familiar with the text. But more importantly, it was the place where this tunnel lay, which I showed the image of, which penetrated into what was extraordinary there is if we look at plate tectonics, we were looking across several hundred feet of raging whitewater, and therefore there was no way into that tunnel physically. I mean, today things might be different. There are drones and things you could experiment with. What was particularly extraordinary there is that we were actually standing on two different land masses that had once been separated by thousands of miles from rock samples that we were able to take on different expeditions, show that this was the suture line between two ancient prehistoric continents that came together and collided and giving rise to the Himalayas. But it was right there in this gap that the suture line remains. So this is an extraordinary just phenomena geographically to stand, as it were, in a landscape that collided to the point of giving birth to the world's highest mountains, but also to somehow or other this tunnel that was either imagined, let's say, to lead to a promised land. The text, as Tupten may have read, describes, it quotes from the Buddhist text attributed to Padmasambhava about what will actually unfold as one makes that journey through the tunnel. But as I also wrote about in the text, in the book, it's a journey that has to be made by the mind, in the same way that Panchen Lama traveled to Shambhala, through his visionary and contemplative meditation rather than physically through the landscape. So what did I find was basically that there always will be another threshold beyond which more mystery remains. And I think this is the beauty of life, is that we never come to some final sanctuary, something that fulfills all our dreams and which, which we can say, I'm just looking for, there's a quote here which I think speaks to this. Hold on one second. Yeah, but essentially, let's just say that that the hidden lands, and this I can't find that quote at the moment, but it's essentially that there's no end. The Yangsang Pemako, the innermost nature. It's not that we find it and kind of rest on those laurels, but it is at the same time true that once we recognize the nature of the mind, then everything that we experience is seen as a great web of interconnected luminosity, and that's the illusory nature of phenomena. That's also the ground of reality, and that's what I think the orientation or a disposition to seek out the hidden lands with it outwardly, inwardly, and secretly can bring us to. It's an unending journey in that sense, but it's a journey we undertake out of love, out of the passion for existence, which, of course, as we know from early Buddhism, means that that's what we actually try to get out of, because that will just keep us circulating in the world of samsara. But we also know once we take the bodhisattva vow in Mahayana, we take a vow to be reborn forever, so that we can actually use our, work with our compassion, a spontaneous compassion arising out of insight into emptiness and luminosity, to engage with the world skillfully, which of course is the third turning. That's the Tantra. If we're in it for the long term, then samsara and nirvana are recognized as being just another ways of seeing, and it's all the same phenomena. So that's the beauty and the power, of Dzogchen, which is of course the outcome of the perfection stage. So we have Dzogrim leading to Dzogchen. And as Chatra Rinpoche always said, we can't really talk about Dzogchen as a path. It's actually the state that results from the practice. But that practice has many ways of engaging it, which largely depend, again, as Chatra Rinpoche always said, depending on one's capacity, meaning depending on one's own constitution and one's disposition, in a sense. So it's always individualized, which is a little bit of what we'll be talking about, in the course next month.
I mean, thank you so much, Ian. Thank you very, very much. That's something which has been, it's not particularly spiritual, but it's something that's bothered me a lot. Mm-hmm. That is the effect of the climate on the Tibetan plateau.
Yes.
I mean, it's called now, is it not, the third pole, because
right.
The water from the Tibetan plateau feeds most of Southeast Asia. I mean, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, they all come, Ganges, the Indus, it all comes from there, doesn't it? and apparently it's drying out, you know. And I
Mm.
just think that because we can't talk about the Dalai Lama, we can't talk about Tibet, no one can even mention Tibet because of the Chinese, you know, attitude towards it as a kind of place which no one is allowed to talk about in any sensible way at all. So, I mean, I would encourage people to ask their MPs or ask people, you know, what is happening with Tibet, you know, because
Yep.
in 40 years' time, there isn't going to be any water, you know, running
Yeah.
down those rivers.
Yep.
It goes on the way it does at the moment. I wonder, have you got any reflections about it, Ian?
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem with the melting of the third pole, the melting of the glaciers of Tibet, the melting of the literally the glaciers right there on Namche Barwa and Gallipoli itself, all of which is creating kind of cataclysmic changes in the landscape and therefore of the ways of life that have persisted when climatic conditions were more stable. So there are huge challenges underway. We can look at the Beyul as it functions in Bhutan, for example, as an indigenous um, form of nature conservation, because there's an imperative within the vision of sacred landscape to preserve nature out of, you know, the vow of compassion, if nothing else. And yet we see how that is not been operative in Tibet simply because it's not a Buddhist ethic that has been directing Chinese policy, obviously. So at the same time, it's not as if it's only, you know, Chinese policy and the attempts to divert water, for example, from the Tsangpo gorges into arid regions of northwestern China, which has been an ongoing project. But it's changes that are occurring now in a way in which human actions, one way or the other, aren't, you know, tragically perhaps capable of reversing. I mean, that is the awful truth that we just don't know. We do, of course, everything we can. You know, it's the Heart Sutra. That, you know, sentient beings are without limit, but we vow to liberate them. In other words, we have to do the impossible. And I think the Heart Sutra, in a way, is that ultimate encouragement to look into the nature of reality and, in a way, to go beyond the hopes and fears, and even the rational mind, into that sense of a kind of functional enchantment, which, of course, the hidden lands are really all about. And that when we embrace this possibility of reality being something far more than we conventionally see it as being, it responds. And this is part of this thing of being in a living universe that the Beyul occasion for us. And that's something I didn't really talk about much in this talk because of time, but it's something that was why I kept going back to Pemaka, because when you bring with it Danang, the pure vision, the landscape reflected it back. You know, when you saw it one way, then the rainbows appeared, when openings occurred. So it was this whole sense that you were participating in a responsive landscape, a responsive universe. And I think that's really what we have to bring to all of our experience, that synchronicities are part of our everyday experience if we just open to them. And that means, in a certain sense, kind of transcending the rational mind, not in the way that we don't use it in every possible way to discern experience and the nature of experience and nature of reality, but not to let it at the same time inhibit the power of the imagination, this ability to leap over, to use a Dzogchen term, into a non-dual field in which of just pure interconnectivity and therefore a pure synchronicity, everything happening at once. This is the fourth state that in the Shakta Kaula tradition talks of as Turiya, but is also spoken about in Dzogchen, you know, the state of consciousness beyond past, present, future, is a fourth state which encompasses all and yet goes beyond those kind of categorizations. So that's all I can say about that, is that it's all about the environment, and certainly anything about Buddhism moving forward that doesn't take into account the universe as a whole and recognize in the beautiful way that the Zen tradition shows us is that, the lotus land is here and now, or it's nowhere. So in other words, if we're not recognizing it in our present day experience and in our present actions and everything we do to bring forth that vision of interconnectivity and mutual, what do you say, responsibility and responsivity, which is perhaps even more to the point when we talk about Buddhism, then we're just using Buddhism as a way of escape, and that, of course, would be a great a misuse of a tradition that's all about awakening and about responsiveness to life as it changes and challenges us in every moment. So I suppose that's where I see, the magic realism, if you will, of the hidden lands intersecting with the very real mandate of environmental activism in the world today as engaged Buddhists.
Well, Ian, I think on that really sort of upbeat note, I think it is an upbeat note. I think
Good.
we should draw the evening to a close. But can I thank you so much for a really enthralling talk. Have given us lots of things to think about. And thank you all for coming, audience, and lovely seeing you all.
But as I said, with any questions, please feel free to email me. And it is actually extraordinary that we didn't mention it, but we are on the eve of the Chinese New Year, and then it will soon be the Tibetan New Year, and it's the year of the water tiger, the tigress. And I think that's the exciting possibility that this year will manifest very differently. And this very much speaks to the hidden lands and to the riding, as it were, the dance with the magical tigress that Padmasambhava was engaged with in his traversing of the hidden lands in Bhutan. So on the eve of, at least from the Chinese way of viewing it, the eve of the water tiger year, with the Tibetan year soon to follow. Thank you all very, very much for being part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Ian. Ian Baker 108@gmail.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yep.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And again, I apologize I couldn't answer a lot of the chats. If you were writing to me directly with direct messages, please do email me and I will respond to them, because I see that there were some here, but I couldn't respond to them. So thanks again, and I'll take leave now. And may it be a wonderful year ahead of us, against all odds. Okay. All best.